If we had to look at the ways in which women were framed on the two shows we just saw and shows in general in the 1970s, women were poorly represented on those shows. Uh, Many of the narratives focused on them taking on undercover roles, often in really sexualized situations, which you never saw with men on these shows or now for that matter. Um, the their status as women on these shows were exploited for their sexual dimensions. It was heavily emphasized that they were able to complete these jobs because they were women and they could use their sexuality to capture criminals, often in these undercover roles, but just in general in the narratives of the shows. It was also the case that they were often allied with a male mentor, a father figure, or another male police officer. That was the case on these shows, and is often the case on the policewomen of Broward County. So here you see a TV guide from the 70s, and you can see Angie Dickinson. How did she ever get on the force? It was a sort of sexist headline from TV Guide at the time. Ultimately, in this period of time, female stars were successful when they reinforced traditional gender roles. So despite the groundbreaking nature of both Police Woman, the show, and Get Christie Love, they still managed to reinforce gender roles in pretty normative ways. The overt focus on the officers' personal lives and their heterosexual relationships were a part of the stories as much as the police work was a part of these narratives. Cox is using post-feminism in her critique of the policewomen of Broward County. We've encountered post-feminism as a theory before, and Cox is certainly applying that here. Ultimately, many reality programs rely on sexist stereotypes. We've talked about this before, and I think the policewomen of Broward County, despite taking the police procedural kind of show in a new direction, still manages to reinforce what we think of as heteronormative patriarchy. So in general, reality shows normalize heterosexual relations on things like game shows. Makeover shows focus on female appearance. The competition shows that we've talked about a little bit often have very explicit patriarchal gender relations. They commodify female sexuality. So a new season of The Challenge is coming up. And I don't imagine it will be drastically different than previous seasons in terms of the male-female dynamic on those shows. And then shows like A Wedding Story, or shows that are focused on marriage, or are often involved heavily in heterosexual relationships, whether it's A Wedding Story or Say Yes to the Dress. Many of those shows deal almost exclusively in heterosexual relations, though more recent shows have branched out a bit from focusing exclusively on male-female relationships. Across all of these genres, the portrayals often rely on stereotypes and conform to what we would think of as gendered ideals of patriarchal society. So again, across reality TV, the genre itself, despite being different than fictional television, still works to reinforce some of the same norms that have been part of television since television's inception. The policewomen of Broward County, females occupy all of the lead roles on the show. They are framed in an overtly feminine way in the narrative of the show. Again, what's unusual is that their private lives are infused in the program. They're not an aside that they're saying while they're driving. The actual narratives of what go on in their families are a part of the show itself. TLC was and to a certain degree is thought of as a cable network for women, not to the degree that Lifetime is framed as a cable network for women, but TLC was traditionally a space for female-oriented programming. Um, if you don't know what TLC stands for, it's supposed to stand for the Learning Channel, but it is also the same channel that featured My Big Fat American Gypsy Wedding. So take that for what it's worth. The way in which television works is it's designed to deliver audiences to advertisers. So if you have a show that's focused on women, on a network that's supposed to cater to women, then the theory is that show and that network would deliver an audience to advertisers. So TLC can charge, X amount of dollars for advertising on their network if they can make the claim that they're going to reach a significant female audience. The show had some spin-offs. You can see some of them here. They were not as popular as is often the case in shows like this. The novelty wears off when you do it too frequently or have too many variations on it. So I would say the Police Women of Broward County was the sort of flagship of these shows, and these other spin-offs were lesser versions of the original. On the show, now we're talking about the Police Women of Broward County, they too would emphasize undercover work for the narratives about undercover work for the female officers. To a certain degree, that reduced them to their physical and sexual attributes. You could juxtapose it against male officers that did not have these kinds of roles. There were screenshots, if you look at the body of the show, no pun intended, that focus on the female body. So that is very much what Laura Mulvey would have called the male gaze in film. I think that applies quite clearly in reality television as a genre, but in this show in particular. The fetish, what Mulvey said and what other theorists have said, is that the camera looks at the female body and fetishizes it. By fetishizing it, it sexualizes the female body. It disempowers the female body as driving the narrative and really objectifies it more than anything else. Here you see one of the female officers and a male partner behind her. So much like the fictional shows from the 1970s, here many of these officers, the female officers, are allied with male officers. That in part, Cox argues, alleviates the show's threat to masculinity by featuring women in these traditionally masculine roles. They fight crime together as a team, which again mitigates the sort of centrality of the female officers on these shows. And there are instances where the male officer comes to the rescue of the female officer, not unlike many police officer situations where male and male police officers help each other. But the show, if it is really about empowering female police officers and letting them be central to the narrative, then having parts of those narratives where the men have to come play the hero really undercuts that narrative of empowerment for the female officer. Emphasizing these officers' roles as women, as mothers, traditional family roles are central to this show. They are not a side note. They're really part of the main narrative. Personal relationships are emphasized on a show like this, which I would say is radically different than something like Cops. And what you hear them say, and what the show implies and explicitly states, is that they're wives and mothers first and police officers second. And you almost never hear those kinds of characterizations for men. I cannot recall an episode of Cops, having seen every episode of Cops, where an officer says, "I'm a husband and a father first, and a police officer second." That just simply doesn't happen. And that their work responsibilities are not as important as their responsibilities at home. This is a very gendered depiction of police work for women. It is not anything we would ever hear in terms of male police officers, and really, again, undercuts the centrality of women in the narrative of this show. Some of the issues that they might encounter at home would be juggling work and family, what they've referred to as mom duties. Both of these instances perpetuate what we would think of as traditional gender roles, differences in the way in which men and women are depicted in popular culture. This show serves to reinforce that. Some of the issues they might encounter at work include instances of rape, sexual battery, domestic violence. These are police calls that they're going on, not that these things are actually happening to them, but they do have sort of a gendered component to them in the nature of the crime itself. That these are the kinds of issues they find themselves addressing, leads one to believe, connects these crimes to their status as women, which we don't see the inverse of with male police officers. In addition, we see them having to deal with sexual problems on the part of criminals, which we do see in terms of male officers, but it's just framed a little bit differently because these officers are women. For this show and for Cox's article, I would suggest that police women of Broward County really just reinforces stereotypical gender roles and is not, in fact, as progressive as it claims to be. TLC, despite being a network for women, perpetuates traditional gender norms in an effort to not be super cutting edge or to be controversial. In fact, Cox would argue that that kind of narrow version of gender is attractive to female audiences. Now, I think that part of Cox's argument is itself a bit reductive, but that is the point that she is making, is that by not breaking new ground in terms of gender, that female audiences are more comfortable with a show like this. The show does feature women in male-dominated roles, so that's a plus. And it does show their lives as being multifaceted and having more to them than just police work. So some people might argue both of those things are themselves progressive. We don't see women in male-dominated roles on many shows, and the fact that it shows the complexity of their lives is not necessarily something that's bad. If anything else, it might even be more realistic than a show like Cops. But by featuring their multifaceted lives in the way that they are, it doesn't place emphasis on their police work, but ends up placing emphasis on their personal lives. What the takeaway from the show is that these women are outside of the norm, that the norm of law enforcement is male, and this is different. Is the show implying that it's different and less? I'm not so sure, but it's definitely demonstrating that this is not the norm. Female police work is not the norm, and male police work is. We know that's not true in real life, but the takeaway from the show is that, hey, we're showing you something different, and that's why this show is interesting.